then I'll just get started. I think that some people go to the design Miro board and look for the link there sometimes. So I saw a few cursors hovering around inside the other board, but I'm sure they'll make their way here soon. Okay. So you guys can see the PDF I have up?
Yes.
Great. All right. So I thought today that I could expand on some of the examples that, that Paul gave yesterday when he introduced exercise 3, and just talk a little more in depth about topography and landscape. So first I'll just go through this lecture, and then I will show you guys some examples of materials and models, and then I'll leave some time at the end for questions. I thought I'd begin by asking this question: what can topography do? We may think about topography as a tool for shaping sight to create visual interest, or to fulfill some engineering function. Maybe we have to mitigate a slope or reinforce a wall, but we can use topography in landscape architecture for so much more than purely functional or aesthetic reasons. So I'm going to take you through some great examples of built projects to show you how topography is used in landscape to question, critique, transform, and evoke more than just site engineering or land art. I'll start here because it's really fun. Topography is often used to create playful landscapes that invite exploration and discovery. This project, The Folds, is a community playground that mobilizes children's perceptions with landform. It's designed with the notion of returning to the basics of play through folding spaces. The designers, Lab D&H, deliberately minimize the use of playground equipment, and they believe that the folding landform can encourage children to perceive this space with their hands and feet. Children can run, climb, play hide and seek, and decide how to have fun by themselves. The designers felt that play space should not be bound by function or program, with less purpose and more instinct. So the folding gesture starts from a series of rolling lawn and later turns into a folding bamboo wood deck with accent metal frames and nets. Surprises can be found through discovering the caves underneath some of the folds. So the sequence of space inspired the designers to explore the possibility of landscape with a pure space, where space returns to its essence, scale, elevation, and atmosphere and texture. Behavior naturally emerges in this interaction between people and the environment. So similarly here, we note that all over the world, playgrounds usually consist of prefabricated elements, which are A to Z tested and 10,000 times certified by various organizations. And that's the easiest and most logistically secure way of doing it. In Munich at the Bundesgarten show in 2005, landscape architect Rainer Schmidt designed a landscape without typical playground elements, just with combining two materials and colors, this tartan red pathway system and the grass. And he modulated the terrain to become an interesting landscape for play. The resulting landscape, as it is, provokes children to jump around and run up and down, to hide between the elements and to engage with landscape. Soft curvilinear forms delineate the territories and islands where children's imaginations, but also adults, I think, can run wild. The next thing I want to discuss is topography for temporality. So topography doesn't always have to mean a permanent earthwork or a permanent installation. Sometimes it can pass away with the forces of nature. On the Summer Island in Heilbronn, a digital designed and built landscape park was created for another Bundesgarten show in 2019. On the plot of about 70 by 500 meters and shaped as a parallelogram, this organically shaped landscape waves join up diagonally at an angle to form a sandy landscape with natural shapes of dunes, moraines, and the ephemeral patterns of sandy landscapes. Wolfgang Schuck, the designer, had been thinking of his homeland and the Alpine foothills with their glacier-shaped, gently undulating moraine landscape. He asked himself, what do wind and water, sliding glaciers, and melting ice do to the kind of soil that builds up at the Neckar River over the years? How does landscape generate itself? And how do we find out in what way nature acts as a landscaper? Finally, how is it possible to recreate the natural wave formation in the soil, which forms ripples with a generative design? Schuck studied early drawings of natural science from the 17th century, in which cartographers had tried to trace the upper Bavarian moraine landscape. He tried to sketch the lines of this sandy beach on paper, but ultimately he used Rhino 3D to generate the landscape. So this landscape, shaped according to the rules of nature, was ultimately created as a data matrix in his office in Kassel. At the early stages of design, the island was covered with large piles of soil. Excavators, large trucks, and tipping lorries had piled up huge deposits of the River Neckar's clayey alluvial soil. And this material was more suited to creating a lunar landscape than a base for a horticultural show. So the construction site had nothing in common with the dream of a summer island that was to be created. But the vision of the ebb and flow of the river over the landscape, leaving runnels and washing away what was there, served as an inspiration for the resulting installation, which was designed as a temporary landscape. This undulating landscape on the summer island was open to the public, with the Bundesgarten shows opening in April 2019. But as a temporary staging, it faded away with the end of summer. We could use topography for water flow. Water is almost always involved in shaping topography, but sometimes we can use topography to help reshape old water systems. The Aire River flows through valleys historically devoted to farming. From the late 19th century, it was progressively canalized. In 2001, the state of Geneva opened a competition with the idea of restoring the river to its original shape by destroying the canal. Instead of undergoing that really destructive way of looking at landscape, the designers proposed to combine the canal with a vast divigation space for the river. For the drawing of the river itself, conscious of the useless effort to design a fixed riverbed and aware that a river usually loves to design itself freely, the designers instead proposed launching a pattern whose form addresses the play between river flow and the prepared terrain. This diamond-shaped pattern opens a complex series of undetermined channels for the flows. These channels were excavated along the entire new river by removing the humus layer, maintaining precise control of the longitudinal profile of the river. The dimensions of these losange-shaped islands were configured to be able to accept the general sizes of the former meanders. The result is spectacular and suggests the devices of most land artists, effecting clearly artificial interventions into a natural situation. And then these are thereafter left to the mercy of natural forces. So 1 year after the opening of the new river space, the results are pretty remarkable. The river flows, displacing diverse materials, gravels, sand, and the geometrical matrix of losanges is significantly modified. We must accept this paradox. The more defined the grid given to the river will be free to design. On the other side, from establishing new water flow, landforms are often used by designers to protect vulnerable urban spaces from floods. When the banks of rivers, lakes, and oceans threaten damage, whether due to intense rain events or rising sea levels, topography is used to mitigate the risk of damage. Corktown Common is a 16-acre park that provides a civic centerpiece for Toronto's fast-growing West Don lands. Located on the banks of the Don River, this park sits atop a concurrently built 16-foot-high flood protection landform that has allowed the West Don lands to be developed. Michael van Valkenburg, his design combines robust new topography, a rich planting palette, and a variety of programs to create a vibrant urban park that celebrates the integration of landscape infrastructure and ecology in the city. To protect the area, the 4-meter tall, 750-meter long earthen landform was constructed out of compacted clay that reshapes the river's floodplain, preventing excess water from traversing towards the Canary District. The berm also forms the basis of the park. Land throughout the site was filled with 50,000 cubic meters of clean soil to nurture new growth. Formerly a flat and barren brownfield with no existing horticultural resources, the reconstructed site ecologies are now growing into a living natural system. Different soil types and depths were designed to support marsh, edge woodlands, and prairie, the range of which provides for experiential variety and wildlife habitat. The plantings are a mix of common and specialist plant species. The new ecologies formed by the landform topography provide habitat and sustenance for migratory birds and pollinators. The park also includes a marsh that increases the viability of waterfowl and other wildlife in the city. Native wildflowers known to self-seed now grow throughout the park in areas increasingly of their own choosing and support an array of butterflies and other pollinators through the seasons. It seems that topography can do everything when it comes to water. When considered as part of hydrological infrastructure, topography can assist in the treatment of wastewater and for bioremediation. Located on the suburban outskirts of New Haven, this Connecticut water treatment facility is a reserve water source for the South Central Connecticut Regional Water Authority. It draws water from nearby Lake Whitney at the base of the Mill River watershed. The use of the most elemental of landscape architecture tools, soil, water, and plants, creates topographical variety and interest through sustainable reuse of excavated soil. Swales replace a traditional engineered drainage system. The planting program, inspired by restoration ecology, is at once primal and sophisticated in its extent and complexity. The new topography is stabilized using bioengineering methods. Site stormwater and runoff from the building's green roof are filtered as they move through the landscape. The planting scheme uses native plants that require no fertilizers or pesticides, reducing the facility's impact downstream. The plant palette is also calibrated for seasonal variation in color and texture and anticipates the natural evolution of plant communities over time. So this landscape is designed to be a didactic microcosm of the entire regional watershed. The swales guide site runoff through a series of discrete landscapes, including farmland, meadow, and valley, before collecting it in a new pond that recharges the groundwater table. The meandering footpaths allow visitors to move through this narrative and consider how water interacts with the land. Topography can be used to recall memory of landscape past. At the Canadian Museum of History, designed by Canadian architect Douglas Cardinal, inaugurated in 1989, it's composed of 2 pavilions. Their architecture is a startling embodiment of the country's distinguishing geographical features. The public display wing replicates the dramatic effect of the glaciers. The contours of the curatorial wing symbolize the majestic Canadian Shield, and the open plaza simulates the vast Great Plains. The layout and the sheer size of the plaza were planned in such a way as to visually incorporate the museum buildings and the Parliament buildings perched across the Ottawa River. But the plaza's lack of appeal had left it empty of visitors for much of the year. To remedy the situation, Claude Cormier extended the museum's original conceptual metaphor, bringing to life what had long remained latent, the swaying grasses of the prairies. The introduction of an urban prairie to the environment creates a microclimate, increases biodiversity, lessens heat island effect, and improves air quality. In short, it lures the public through an appeal to the senses without in any way hindering the stunning view that defines the site. The prairie topography has been recreated through hillocks interspersed along the plaza and wound through by snaking pathways, suggestive both of the museum's curves and the soft undulating prairie landscape. The granite paving stones hug and accentuate the gently rising mounds. So topography is here used to allow for planting microclimates that subtly alter the experience of the site depending on time of day and the time of the year. The hills also allow for greater diversity of species to be used, and in this way transform the site in memory of the Canadian landscape it was originally meant to conjure, the rolling hills of the prairies. Another way to exhibit memory is demonstrated in the historic landscape of Lorch Abbey. The central idea is to render history visible as landscape space, aiming to make remnants and former existence of the monastery legible again. At the site of the historic Lorch Abbey, most of the history has been wiped clean. The historic monastery is in fact missing. What is left is a void of history, a nothingness strikingly elegant, powerful, and compelling. The aim was to exemplify and emphasize this emptiness, to express presence and history through the site's inherent and austere nothingness. The ground is based on the language of the design is based on the language of the ground. What today can safely be considered the true extent of the waned monastery is retold through topographic gestures. To resurrect historical tangibility, the footprint of the lost compound and the central axis of the monastery were traced and etched into the landscape. The outlines of the church, the walled entrance court, and the conclave with its cloister are defined and represented by slightly protruding terrain. A sharply drawn raised slope, some 35 centimeters high, creates an imprint of lost architectural volume, generating absence legible in space. The open lawn terrain and grass-covered traced footprints are materially seamlessly unified. Like a tactile writing system of Braille, the landscape undulates with physical symbols craving to be read. Across the open field, the sharp angles of the former architectural footprints jut into the terrain, creating provocative architectonic forms through the lush green landscape. Through the juxtaposition of the scenic landscape and the raised geometric forms, a quiet but dramatic poeticism is born. These geographical imprints read as the ghosts of history stamped on the historical open landscape. While at first perceived as incidental insignia, as the viewer steps away, full forms are born through the raised outlines. Shapes become recognizable, building imprints are legible, and architectural volumes are imagined. Subtle difference from the memory of structures and landscapes is the use of topography as a monument. We often see monuments dotting the landscape, as in memorial spaces, urban plazas with commemorative statues and fountains, or in cemeteries. But topography can also act as a monument itself. In 2008, a huge earthquake in China's Sichuan province was responsible for the death of nearly 70,000 people, with over 18,000 people missing. The disaster was the country's deadliest earthquake for more than 30 years, and in terms of casualties, was regarded as one of the worst ever recorded. The earthquake's epicenter was Wenchuan County, and is here where the architecture faculty of Tongji University was commissioned by the Chinese government to build a museum as a memorial to those who lost their lives. The Wenchuan Earthquake Memorial Museum takes the form of a ruptured landscape. Large subterranean buildings are topped with green roofs, ensuring that the complex adopts an unobtrusive presence. Gaps in this man-made terrain provide access inside the museum, while simultaneously connecting the entirety of the site. Dramatically angled walls are made from weathering steel, creating a series of enclosed external spaces that contain benches for contemplation and reflection. The splitting apart of the landscape is a visual reminder of the earth being torn apart and showing the vast chasms that open when loved ones are taken away. Topography can serve as a sound mediator. Paul showed some images from this project yesterday, but I wanted to go into a little more detail on how topography can offer silence. When the fifth runway of Skippal Airport, the Polderbaan, was opened for operation in 2003, residents living in the area were burdened with ground noise. Ground noise is low-frequency noise caused by aircrafts taking off. On behalf of the Skippal Group, a multidisciplinary project team designed a recreational art park that simultaneously reduces ground noise from the airport. The design is a unique integration of landscape architecture, land art, and innovative technology. The basic elements consist of 3-meter-high embankments, which disperse the ground noise. 1-meter-wide paths between the ridges serve as walking paths for visitors from Hoofddorp. The ground ridges are placed perpendicular to the sound waves for optimal sound reduction. The land art park Buitenschot not only reduces noise from the aircrafts, but also adds aesthetic and recreational values to the area. This has led to specific form that has an interesting relationship with the orderly grid of the Haarlemmermeer polder. Through vistas and lines of sight, smaller and bigger rooms emerge, which can be used for sports and cultural events. To the north and south, the grassy ridge structure extends until it dissolves into longitudinal pyramids, distributed along the edges. Unique art objects are placed on the pyramids, inspired by parabolic sound mirrors, exploring the meaning of sound in this soundscape. So related to topography for silence, I think, is the use of topography for security and fortification. This is particularly true of the trenches and bunkers used during the Great Wars. Since ancient times, earthworks have been used to build up ramparts and walls, but in World War I, earth was dug out in trenches, and these now create scarred landscapes across Europe. The Green Roadworks is a former defensive trench and bunker system dating from around 1918. The site is part of a larger military landscape belonging to the Lek Axis, a complex of forts, works, and bunker systems built to defend the River Lek from invasion from the east. Unique for the site is the range and variety of bunkers peppered throughout the site. Between 1945 and 2010, most of the trench system had been removed. Much of the complex had become unrecognizable, overgrown, and difficult to access. The designer Redscape's design proposed the partial restoration of sections of the original trench system, reestablishing its relationship to the surrounding landscape. The bunkers were unearthed and recreational routes were added. The newly reconstructed works enabled visitors to experience the original intention of the military defenses. The nature and ecology of the site was strengthened by developing freshwater habitats for amphibians and tree cover for nesting owls, as well as open grassland areas for foraging bird life. The works are maintained by grazing sheep. 4 new ecological zones were implemented to give space to a new diversity of flora and fauna. These include the bunkers, some of which are now inhabited by bats. Finally, I want to showcase how topography can illustrate geological forces on a site. The Fold is a schoolyard playground located in Geneva between a modernist housing complex and a school. The concept is a sculpture landscape, monumental and elongated, and contextually based in the land nearby Geneva. Its forms are interpretation of the force that spawned the landscapes of the Jura Massif, or the Jura Folds nearby. Bringing the forces to the surface offered a critique on the principle of tabula rasa that guided the development of the modernist housing complex beyond. This project questions, is site really empty and flat, or should it express what shaped it? The project takes as its inspiration for form the geological processes and erosion over time. Studying the patterns of geological time and folding of layers of terrain help to establish distinct, locally derived formations that draw and dig into the landscape. Creating an undulating, folding, natural looking, but not natural functioning landscape, the designer questions play and land art in the schoolyard and in the nearby housing district. The resulting landscape is part play area, part topographic installation, and part artistic commentary. So there are many more examples of what topography can do, show, and comment on within landscape. I wanted to show you these examples so you could see how simple moves can have a big impact on site. One of the characteristics of landscape architecture is that our designs tend to be more subtle than the work of architects and urban designers, considering as we do the importance of shifts in landform, microclimates, and small-scale ecosystems. But we can also make bold impacts on the land through topography, these visible and graphic excavations or superimpositions that bring forward the forces acting on site. So please take these examples away and think about your sites, the characteristics that you've studied so far, and really begin to think of how the verbs on the Richard Serra list could begin to be deployed on your site in a model context. With that said, I thought that I would show you some really great examples of models and modeling materials, both outside of our program and also from the students last year to give you some ideas. These are two paper sculptures by artist and Angela Glachkar. Even though these are massive compared to what you'll be working on, I thought that they were really interesting explorations using a very simple and basic material, plain white paper. You don't really need to use expensive or difficult materials here. I think what's especially beautiful about this use of a simple material is the way that it's layered to really highlight light and atmosphere. This is another work by a different paper artist. Her name is Lauren Collin. Here she has incised the paper to create scales and then lifted and layered the incisions. This is a really complicated and delicate work, but it is another demonstration of how a simple and inexpensive material can be manipulated through intentional cuts to create form. Don't underestimate the power of sand and rocks. Scraping, pushing, dropping, or sifting would be appropriate verb actions to apply to this type of material. This is an installation at the Serpentine Pavilion by Michelangelo Pistoletto. The corrugated cardboard is endlessly looped here, and I think this approach creates a really fertile ground to bring in another verb action to begin to create topography. Finally, these are a few models from last year's students. This one used a framework over which fabric was stretched. Two more approaches here. We have paper mache over a wireframe and a model composed of sand, aggregates, and clay. Keep in mind that these students were working on a different design assignment, so these models are not necessarily about topography, but they are examples of ways you can show topography through models. And last image, clay is malleable and easy to form and reform, and it also holds its shape well when cut. So I hope that gives you some good ideas for how you might approach the next assignment. And now I am going to open it up to questions and answers. So just a note that with the next exercise, I won't be posting any tutorials unless there are very specific questions you need help with. But this is really about material explorations. And everyone is going to choose a different set of materials and a different set of verbs to enact. So it wouldn't make sense for me to try to cover all of the possibilities. But I'm going to assume that you guys are responsible enough not to cut off your fingertips with X-Acto knives or glue your eyelids open or breathe in, spray glue inside your house. So you'll have this week without tutorials to explore materials. And then next week, when you begin drawing and drafting this up in Rhino, I will put out tutorials that will be related specifically to modeling and drawing methods in Rhino, as well as some tips on model photography. So I'm going to go back to the chat and see if there's any questions. And then if anybody else has extra questions, I can answer them here. Yeah. Okay, I'm just reading through the comments. There are so many examples of amazing topographical landscapes. Okay. So, questions?
I have a question.
Yeah.
For those of us working in kind of denser, more urban areas, how should we take in like building footprints? Like, should we try to work, like, should our area be within like a more open space? Or I'm just wondering how we should consider what's already existing.
What's already existing? Yes. So it's okay if you want to propose the removal of something from your landscape.
Okay.
I think that every site that is being worked on has open space opportunities already, pretty much. Like I think for this exercise, you might want to look at the existing open spaces and use those as your sort of base area to work from. Unless, I mean, if you have a specific idea about evoking a previous footprint, keep in mind it doesn't need to be located in the exact same spot that it was before.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
A question actually about Lorch Abbey.
Mm-hmm.
That one was really cool. It just seems so subtle that the mounds are only 30 centimeters high. Do you know how they would like try to ensure the longevity if the soil is going to move?
My guess is that they have used geofoam blocks to build up those mounds. So oftentimes in landscape, especially when we're working in urban areas, when you see really dramatically, yeah, this one's not very dramatic, but when you do see dramatic high landscape forms, oftentimes the inside is composed of foam to build up with a layer of soil over top, unless there's like a really strong foundation. But like oftentimes in the city, you're building over top of LRT systems, subway systems, underground works, parking garages, and land weighs a lot. Like it's really heavy. So especially when you start putting trees in parks and things like that. So geoengineering has been a really amazing tool for landscape architects. But I would assume that that sharp shape is created from foam blocks.
That's cool. Yeah, every time I see those super sharp landforms in a landscape, they look so cool, but I'm always like, how long are they going to last that sharp, you know?
Yeah, yeah. And I don't know, I would have to read more about the intentions of the project to see if the fading away of those footprints is also part of the landscape strategy. That would fit into landscape as a temporal installation as well.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah. Well, I'm just gonna close my curtain. It's bright. That's better.
There was mention. I can't remember if it was you or Paul yesterday. There was mention of topographical tools that help mitigate urban heat retention, and I was wondering if you have any examples or can speak to that at all.
Topography itself doesn't mitigate heat retention.
Just vegetative?
Well, although
or...
it can, because one of the things that I wasn't able to put into the lecture is topography for air.
Yeah.
And airflow over a site. So like this has to do with the creation of microclimates and the sort of really subtle modulation of airflow. And the reason I didn't put it in was because I couldn't find a really good example or diagram that would like prove that it worked. But I know that there are projects that kind of engage this as a side topic. My instinct would be to say that creating landform moves wind and air in various ways. And just from what I know about walking through naturalized landscapes, if you're at the base of a big hill, it's always a few degrees cooler than it is on the top, right? And so topography for airflow and like green air or fresh air corridors, I think is something that you could look into.
Cool.
Yeah. But I would say like a lot of the mitigation for urban heat island also comes from the evapotranspiration of the plants that are planted on the topography. So that
And shade.
and shade and yeah, shading strategies. So having a lot of tree cover within the topography, you know, and I've seen strategies where you take the sunny side of a slope and you plant it up a lot with like smaller trees like birches or aspens. And then those create like, they kind of like enhance the height of the topography, but they also create shade for the areas below it. So
cool.
Question. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. Yesterday, Paul was saying that the intention of this project is to like alter the human experience or enhance it in some way. But now I'm kind of thinking after your presentation now, it can also, or maybe entirely be about function or restoration, if that makes sense. Like from my side, I'm kind of thinking of doing something that benefits the actual landscape, and then the human experience of it is kind of like a bonus at the end. Is that reasonable, do you think?
yeah, I was a little surprised actually when Paul said that yesterday, because I don't think that all landscapes need to be for humans. I don't think that every design is in service of our aesthetic experience of a land. But I think that the truth is, in design, we're highly focused on what that aesthetic experience is. And so even if the only audience for your intended topographical installation are the 20 students in this class and your 2 instructors, those can be the human audience, even if you don't intend people to actually visit. But I think the valuable thing about considering the human experience is understanding scale and understanding emotion and atmosphere. So animals and nature are neutral. They're not experiencing landscapes the same way that we do. And I think it is valuable to consider those human emotions, sensitivity, feelings of poetic experiences, delight, sublime experiences. So yeah, it doesn't have to be designed specifically for human use, but I would consider the human gaze and experience.
And then the second part of my question is, how do I, if I'm doing something for a restoration or something along those lines, how do I know what works? Like, I'm sure we'll learn about that next semester or next year, but like, I don't want to like propose something that actually destroys what's already there because I don't know any better.
I'll give you a pro tip. Nobody is going to teach you how to do it.
Okay.
That is kind of, well, although I don't know, maybe they will. In next year, I have no idea what they're going to teach you. But my experience has been that when you want to find out specific information about how to construct landscapes that are serving an ecological function, you have to do the research yourself, and you kind of propose it, and then people who have done that will comment on it and give you feedback. But I haven't met a class yet that said like, this is how you reconstruct a wetland, this is how you remediate, you know, these types of soils. It's simply too huge of a field to handle. And so I think that landscape architecture is like a field of research and is ongoing research all the time. I had to learn about green roofs from like the LEED standards document and calculating green roofs and stuff like that and irrigation requirements. I did that like in half an hour at my desk at my job. I wish that somebody had like taught me about it, but they didn't. So.
Okay. Yeah, that's good to know because it's definitely really important.
Yeah, if you're curious about something and you want to know, my suggestion would be like, in an ideal world, this would all be stuff that we can cover in Design Studio, but like there's so much information that you're going to want to know right now. Just pursue it, you know.
Okay.
Yeah.
Meredith, there's a whole master's program in ecological restoration that one of my friends took. So I mean, if it takes a whole master's program to do it, maybe
I know.
maybe it's better to just go a little bit on it, but not overwhelm yourself.
Do you guys like? Are you able to access libraries where you are? Anybody? No.
Like there's a public library, but it's not very good.
Right. At University of Guelph, do they allow like, I guess if you're not a student, you probably can't reserve books or, yeah.
I could probably get my friends to do it that I know here. I couldn't do it myself.
Like it's really hard. I have had books on reserve at the library that I wanted to use as references and readings for this course. And I reserved them through the Vancouver Public Library like 2 months ago and they haven't come through. So it's really, it's really hard to access this kind of information unless it's published online or unless you can sort of like, so you're a little bit stuck right now, which is unfortunate because normally if we had access, well, you should have access to the UBC library at least, but I don't know how many digital publications they have in this field. So
yeah. Can I maybe say what I'm thinking for my thing? I don't know if it like qualifies for this project, but I was thinking of doing something called hugel culture. Have you heard of that?
No.
It's like an agricultural idea. I think it's from the Netherlands or something where you like build these kind of like berm things, but you use logs and sticks and mud and you make it like this kind of mound and then you plant right on top of it. So the planting is like elevated, but then over time, like the soil, it all decomposes and eventually kind of sinks down again. Mm-hmm. So that's like pretty technical. Like it's not very, it could be poetic, I guess, but it's like, I don't know if that's topographical enough for this.
So I think that it's great that you have an idea about how you want to enact topography on your site, but I also think that this exercise is about exploring form. Mm-hmm. And I think you should approach it without preconceived ideas about what you want to achieve.
Okay.
That's the purpose of these 3 study models and applying the different verb actions is like, actually we're taking away your brain for a minute and just forcing you to use your hands and your eyes to say like, what does this do? What does this feel like? Not what purpose does it serve, not like how can I make it do something, but explore.
Okay. And are the 3 study models, are they all, it's 3 different materials, but is it all the same exploration or is it like, I guess we have different verb actions for each one. So it's like 3 totally separate ideas.
That's right.
Yeah. Okay.
Maybe it says this in the assignment handout and I just missed it, but we picked the same site for all 3 models, correct?
Yes, you select one part of your site, approximately 100 meters by 100 meters, and then you do the 3 study models, formal explorations within that site.
Great.
A question about the perspective or the perspective photos. So if, like, for example, if my model is like a folded paper, then my perspective photo would just be of that paper, but from a low angle, like as if I was small on the model. Is that what you're looking for?
I think that sounds about right, but we're going to get more into that later. I think I'm going to do a tutorial on model photography. At UBC, there's like the opportunity to bring your model into like a studio and set up lights and kind of photograph it like that. And we're going to just do the at-home version. But it's really important to take good pictures of your models. And just as Paul put in the assignment, how you can sort of like begin to imagine the scaled experience of the landscape by, as you said, like bringing your camera right down into the page and getting almost like a macro view of what's happening. You can begin to extrapolate that into visualization. So I'm going to go into more detail about that.
Sounds cool.
Any other questions? Are you guys ready to go and get some modeling materials? Yeah.
I was thinking about waiting until after our discussion to get modeling materials. Is that like, I don't want to get something, choose that it's the wrong thing after having a conversation, and then I just.
There's no such thing as the wrong thing.
True.
It's you are directing this process. So if you bring a block of clay, we're not going to tell you wrong, take it back, go get paper. You are the designer, so you decide what you want to focus on and what materials you're interested in to enact these actions.
I guess I worded it wrong. I didn't necessarily mean wrong for you. I just meant I would rather have the discussion first and maybe conceptualize my site a little bit better and then choose my materials afterward.
Does anybody else feel a similar kind of apprehension? Pierre? You're worried? Oh, go ahead.
I bought some stuff already, but it was kind of difficult because I didn't know how much to get. So I went definitely on the side of getting less than more. So I kind of understand where Nicole is coming from in this case.
Mm-hmm. I mean, keep your receipt. Keep your receipt if you need to return it. And the Sayers offers a great 10% student discount. And then if you need more, get more. I don't know. It's like, I have a whole bunch of stuff that could be modeling materials, and paper is not very expensive. So I think that if you're planning on purchasing something that's like really like feels like a financial commitment, maybe that's the wrong approach. But if you're like, you should be able to get a wide variety of relatively inexpensive materials that you can use for this exercise. Like I showed you a whole bunch of ways to use paper and cardboard, stuff that you probably already have in your recycle bins. So even starting with that and then seeing if you want to progress to like a different material later, that's totally fine.
Have you ever used Lego blocks for landscape design?
Sorry, what?
Lego blocks.
Lego blocks.
Yeah.
I have not. I have not.
Okay.
But I'll be curious to see how you do.
I thought it was common practice. I thought you were like, I thought you'd be saying something like, yes, they're super useful for that, that, and that. But since you said no, I'll try for myself and see.
I think that Lego blocks, in my opinion, they kind of predetermine what you're going to do. Like, I know it's true. You can get really creative with Lego, but because it's already the shape of a block, it's kind of, I would be curious to see how you can make a verb action work with this already existing block. You might be able to do it.
There's also like a scale limitation. You have to build beyond a perfect size, I mean, a certain size for it to get fluid.
Yeah, but since my site is all rippled because like it's regularly rippled because of the agricultural work, I felt that Legos, if I could stretch something on it, like just in the intersection, they're already linear, so I could have maybe used that. But I'll think about it.
Do you guys have scale rulers? Because you're gonna need them for this exercise. So like you guys have these. Okay, so measure a Lego block and see how big of a scale your elevation will be when you use one. I think that will help you decide if it's a good tool or not. Maybe you want to create some huge landforms on your site. You never know.
Stephanie, how realistic do we need to be in our ideas? Like if we're talking about like we can make really big landforms, how big is too big?
I think at this point, the focus should be on exploring materiality and the action in the landscape. Now, I was a little curious when Paul released the brief that he said only 3 models, because I actually would have maybe done it a little bit differently. I think that I would have said, first start with sketch models, and sketch models are often not to scale. They're just kind of, those are real explorations. And when you start with a sketch model, then you can progress to a measured model and sort of figure out what is realistic or what translates to your site. So this might be this is not going to be a deliverable for you, but if I was you, I probably would do some sketch models first and just kind of test out ideas and materials like at a really small, like just the scale of what you can hold in your hand without thinking about like how high is this, how low is this, and then that way I think you can really free yourself to think about form and action. And then when you begin to translate that into a measured scale model, that's when you begin to ask those questions like, is this realistic? How high is too high? How low is too low? Maybe I'm gonna show you guys something quickly. I'm gonna stop that share. I have this perspective project. You may have seen it. It was posted a few years ago. Just a sec. Okay. You guys see this? Yeah. So this is Central Park in New York. And the premise behind it was essentially that when we look at Central Park, we see the very tips of 3 geological landforms. And this speculative proposal unearths those landforms and unearths the landscape below Central Park, what it would have looked like before Manhattan was built up to this point. So how high is too high and how low is too low? I mean, when you're talking about landform and geology, we have mountains. We have really high mountains in Vancouver, and we have really flat tidal plains. And I think that the scale of landscape is one of the most exciting things about it, is that it can be enormous and still make sense. So. What's the Coffee Cup Mountain project?
Oh, if anybody was in intro week, there was a presentation from one of the faculty about how he was thinking of how many coffee cups, like disposable coffee cups, are used in Vancouver every day, and then he thought of piling them all into a mountain to show everybody the scale of like their consumerism and waste. I thought that was really funny. It just reminded me, like, you know, how big is too big? Well, I mean, if we're using that much material every day, then it's not that much of a stretch to make a mountain that tall.
Totally. Yeah. Yeah. Scale is definitely like can be used to make statements about stuff like that. And it's often not until we're confronted with the scale of something that we really begin to think about it. Anything else? All right, then I'll release the class early, and we'll see you guys tomorrow with your ideas about your model and your actions.
So just to be clear, tomorrow all we're bringing is ideas?
Let's just go back to the brief and see what it says.
As in, like, we have a site in mind and have it delineated, but we're bringing hypotheses, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So October 1st, which is tomorrow, desk crits to review selected site, verb actions, reasoning, and selected materials.
Cool. I suppose I could have read that
guess,
myself.
Yes. So Nicole, if you don't want to purchase your materials yet and you do want to wait for discussion, that's totally fine. But some people might have clear ideas about what they want to use already, in which case I encourage you to go out and go bananas. Yeah.
Yeah, I have a wealth of materials here just from like being an artsy fartsy type of person anyways, but I think I want to try something new, but I'm just not sure what that new thing is yet.
Okay. Sounds good. All right, so I'll close this Zoom call out. I'll see you guys tomorrow.
Thanks, Steph.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.